Now let's deal with probably the most confusing part of JavaScript, and at the same time its simplest part, which is the context. Let's immediately look at a simple example. I will create a function in JavaScript called hello, and this function will do the following. In the console, it will output a message, for example, hello, and as a second parameter, we will output a special keyword this, which points to the current context. If we now refresh the page in the browser and call the hello function, we will see the following result. Here we get the string hello, and as the second parameter, we get an object, which is actually the window object. The window object is a global object, and if we expand it, we will get the same set of functions, and you have probably used it often. For example, you called the alert function when you were learning JavaScript and got a window like this. So this is the global object. It might still be unclear, but let's figure it out with the next example. Let's say I create a new object, which I will call person. This will be an object, and let's say it has simple fields, for example, name, Vladilin, age, for instance, 25. And here I will create a new function. Let's say I will call it say hello. And then, as the value of this function, I will specify the function that we have already created, which means it will be the hello function. Now if we refresh the page in the browser and refer to the object, if we log it to the console, we will get the expected result. That is, it is clear that this object has a function say hello, but if we call this function on the person object, here we get the following result. We also get the value hello, which is output in the hello function. But instead of the keyword this, we get the object itself. You can compare it with the log above, and these are absolutely identical entries. Now, how does this work? In fact, we can rewrite the call to the hello function a little differently. Instead of just calling the hello function, we can also refer to the global window object and its hello function. And if I press enter now, as you can see, we get the old result, and this is the main idea. Essentially, when we call either the say hello function or just the hello function, we always log the keyword this to the console. And it, roughly speaking, points to the object in the context of which it was called. That is, what is to the left of the dot where we call this function so. When we call the hello function on the global window object, we get this object window instead of the keyword this. If we call the say hello function on the person object, instead of the keyword this, we get the person object itself. And the keyword this, it is always dynamic. It points to the object in the context of which it was called. And in fact, that is all the theory regarding context. Now let's play around with this a bit and see how we can interact with the context. Suppose we want to create another function in the person object, but it should also refer to the hello function. And we want the context there to be the global window object, not the person object itself. How can we do this? Let's say, for example, I establish a function say hello window and pass a reference to the hello function as an argument. But if we leave everything as it is obvious that the context here will be the person object, because if we save and refer to this object, call the say hello window function, then as the keyword this we get person again. That is, what is to the left of the dot. So, in order to pass any context and call a function with the specified context, we can use the built-in methods that functions in JavaScript have. I remind you that in JavaScript, all objects are objects, including functions, which have their own specific methods. So, we can call a special method on the hello function, which is called bind. And as a bind, as the value of this function, we can pass the context that will be bound to this function. That is, for example, the global window object. And if we refresh the page now and repeat the call, then, as you can see, even though we are calling this function on the person object, we still get the window object in the console because we have bound this context. Interestingly, we can even rewrite it using this call and pass the keyword this here. And if we refresh the page and repeat the call, nothing will change. Because in reality, if we simply write this in the console, we will see that this points to the global window object. We can easily verify this, as in this case, this equals window, because even with a triple comparison, we get the value true in the console. If, for example, we pass another object here, such as document, we will get the corresponding result. As you can see, now we get the message hello, but as the keyword this, we get the document, which, roughly speaking, is the deepen tree. Alright, now let's think about how we can use this for our purposes. Suppose I add another function to the person object, which I will call, for example, loginfo. This will be a function. And what are we going to do here? Essentially, we want to output information about this object in the console within this function. That is, suppose I will write in the console, here I use backticks, inside which I can dynamically pass parameters. And I will write, for example, name from. And then, in order to refer to the field that exists in the object, first of all, I use this notation to output dynamics within the string. Next, I specify this, which in this case will be the person object, because we are creating this function in the context of this object. And in the keyword this, that is, roughly speaking, in the person object, we have a name field. That is, it is the same notation, but to make the code more universal, we write this name here. If we save now and, let's say, refer to our object, called the loginfo function, we will get the expected result. That is, it says name is Vladilin here. We can add another console log. And also display their age, this age. And as you can see, we get the corresponding result. That is, these keys are taken from this object. And the keyword, this refers to the context of the person object. But let's say we have another object, for example, I'll call it Lena. This will also be an object that has a field name equal to the value Elena, and, let's say, she will be 23 years old. Now we have a separate object, but the Lena object does not have the loginfo function. The question is, can we use the loginfo function to output the value of the Lena object instead of the person object? In fact, we can, and we have already done this. That is, we simply refer to the person object and call the loginfo function. If we just call it now, we will get the expected result. That is, we call this in the context of the person object, but in order to pass the desired context that we specify ourselves, we can call the bind method on the loginfo function, where we will pass the Lena field. However, if we refresh the page now, we won't get any value because the bind method doesn't actually call the function. It returns a new function that has already bound the new context. Therefore, we can call this function right away. If we refresh the page, look at what we get. Now we use the loginfo function, but we passed a different context to it. And when we call this function, the keyword this points to the context of the object that we passed. Therefore, in the console, we get the message name is Lena and age is 23. Now let's make our code a bit more complex and, let's say, make the loginfo method more elegant. For this, we can use the console object, which has a method called group. We can pass a string to it, which will serve as the title of this group. That is, this does not relate to the context. I am just showing some capabilities in JavaScript. And let's say we will use this name as the title and then output the message info, followed by a colon. Next, we will specify some console logs that will belong to this group, and at the end, we need to close this group by calling the groupEnd method. So now, if we refresh the page, we will get a result like this. That is, we can even collapse this value in the console, and we see that the title of this group refers to the name of this person, and inside, there is a list of specific fields. Suppose, now what are we going to do with this, for example? We want to pass additional parameters to loginfo. For example, the job of this person, meaning the job parameter, and also output it in a group. That is, we refer to console.log and write job is and then the value of the job parameter. In this case, we do not specify this because we pass this parameter to the function. And also, let's suppose we will accept another parameter, which I will call phone. This means we will also output this person's phone number. Here I will write phone and here I pass the parameter phone. If we leave everything as it is now, we are calling the loginfo function with the Lena object in the console, but we are calling this function without parameters. Yes, and in the console, we will get the corresponding result undefined, and it is precisely with this example that I want to show how we use the bind method, for instance, to pass properties. The first way is, of course, when we get a new function. Let me rewrite this in more detail. That is, I will create a new function, for example, fnLenaInfoLog. I don't know how clear this name is, but I think we can figure it out. That is, this is a new function, and here we can call it fnLenaInfoLog. Refreshing the page, we get the same result. We can certainly pass some new parameters to this function. For example, Lena will have the profession of front-end. And, for example, her phone number will also be in string format 8999. Well, in this case, the value doesn't really matter. Yes, we are just practicing with it. We refresh the page, and we get the expected result. That is, in the loginfo function, we receive the parameters that we passed. And, in principle, there's nothing unusual about this, right? Because that's how we pass parameters in JavaScript. But with the bind method, we can do it a little differently. In addition to specifying the context as the first parameter, which should be bound to the new function, we can pass other parameters that the function needs. That is, I simply pass them separated by commas. And then I call the fnInfoLog function without any parameters. But if we refresh the page, we won't see any difference. So this is the first method. You have probably also heard that JavaScript has two other methods called call and apply. So, how do they work? Let me remove this call for clarity and call the function on a separate line. So, I think everything is clear with bind. Yes, if we refresh, nothing changes. But there is another method called call, and it serves exactly the same purposes. But it has one small difference from the bind method. That is, suppose I also want to call a function on the person loginfo object, and I want to pass the context of the Lena object to it. So, I can call the call method, pass the Lena object into it, and essentially it accepts the same parameters in the call method as in the bind method. That means I can just copy and paste them. But here you see the difference, that now in the call method I am not calling it as a function. Let me comment this out, refresh the page, and get the corresponding result. That is, the call method, in addition to setting a specific context for the function in some parameters listed through commas, also immediately calls this function. The bind method, on the other hand, returns a new function that we can call whenever we want. The call method calls it immediately. And there is also another method called apply. So, essentially, I will rewrite our functionality a bit differently. I will write loginfo. Next, I will apply the apply method to this function. As the first parameter, we also pass the object that should be the context. In our case, this object is Lena. And there is a small difference from the call method. In the applied method, we always pass two parameters. That is, unlike, for example, the call method where we can pass an infinite number of parameters. Here, if we want to pass these parameters to the newly created function, we must specify them in an array. That is, the second parameter is always an array of arguments that will be passed to this function. And the applied method, it will immediately call this function. So, if we refresh the page, we will get the same result. So, to reiterate, the call and apply methods differ only in the way they pass parameters to the function we bind. Now let's practice a bit with prototypes and context. Because in response to the previous video, you mentioned that there weren't enough practical examples. Let's, for example, consider a very simple example of how we can combine context and prototypes. Let's assume I have an array, which I will call array, and it will consist of some values, 5 numbers. And let's say we have a task to write a function that will multiply each value of a given array by a certain number that we will pass. So usually, what would you do? You would write a function, for example, by. Let's assume we will pass some number here. And in order to modify the array, we will also pass an array here, that is, some array. And what are we going to do here? We will return this array, iterate over it using the map method, where in each and every iteration we will call the function that we pass here. The function will take each individual element of the given array, and we will simply return that array element multiplied by the number m. So it looks something like this. Yes, and now we can look in the console to see what we get. That is, we call the mountBy function, in which we pass some array, and let's say the number we want to multiply each element by will be 5. So, if we refresh the page now, we will get the corresponding result. That is, if we pass 15, we will get the respective values. But in reality, this is not the most convenient option in some cases because this function will always need to be imported in order to call it. You will always need to pass some array to it, and so on. And often in interviews, they ask how to make it so that this array immediately has a method that allows similar functionality. And precisely for this, we can use prototypes. So, I will comment all of this out. Then, I will refer to the global object array, which is the parent class for this array object. Next, I will refer to its prototype. And after that, I can create some new functions here. For example, the function mountBy. And this function will also take a certain number, and here we essentially need to repeat the functionality that we did here. But how do we determine which specific array to apply this to? And that's exactly why we will use the keyword this. So, for now, let's temporarily output a message in the console, for example, mountBy and the message this. Now we need to slightly rewrite the function call. Given that we have extended the array prototype, we can refer to our array, call the mountBy method on it, and let's say with the value 2. If we refresh the page, we will get the mountBy message here, and then we see the same array on which we made this call. In essence, the keyword this refers to the array on which we are calling this method. This means we can then repeat the functionality. I will just uncomment it, and here, instead of returning some array r, we simply refer to the keyword this because this keyword points to the object that is to the left of the dot, and in our case, it is our array. Let's output the result to the console, and as a value, we will get the result we expected. That is, each element of this array is multiplied by 2. If we pass the value 20 here, as you can see, we get different values. And this is cool because now, to modify the elements of each array, even a new array, we don't need to call a separate function. That is, for example, right in the console, I can create another array, for instance, 5, 8, 12, and immediately call the mountBy method on it and pass a value, for example, 4, and you can immediately see what result I will get. That is, I do not call a separate function, I do not create it. It is immediately available on this object, and it is very convenient to use. That is, we can extend objects like errors, strings, and basically anything, promises, in other words, all the classes that we have or those classes that are present. And in conjunction with the keyword this, which each time points to the element that is to the left of the call, we get very flexible and interesting code.